Delaware hasn't adopted UCITA. Now, what that means is that it's just like any other contract for them. They have to find assent. You know, most states will sort of follow as a general. I think what you'd find is that the sort of click-through and acceptance of click-through terms is becoming more and more accepted as acceptable procedure for enforceability. And the trend has actually been across the country, not just in Delaware and not just in Maryland and Virginia, but across the country. The trend has been to more readily accept click-through terms and assent procedures that are included in the document within the application itself. Any other questions on that issue? Yeah.
Yeah. Just a question. So we're talking about licensing models for applications, which
Yeah.
something that's installed.
Yeah.
Is it different when you're talking about more software as a service?
Sure.
You're
Sure.
not really installing anything. You're just
Sure, you're really providing folks access. So that, you know, the question was, is it different? Are the rules different when you're talking about software as a service? And you know, a lot of the same concepts apply to software as a service. Now, software as a service, I think a lot of people make the mistake of, and you'll frankly see a lot of terms out there that'll make the mistake of classifying that as actually granting somebody a license. Now, one thing that differs license agreements from other types of agreements is granting a license to somebody actually grants them a property interest. A license is a limited property interest. Now, in most well-drafted software as a service agreements, you're actually not granting a license. You're granting the right to access some features and functions. Now, as far as enforceability, then you'd go back to relying on sort of your general contract principles and making sure that you have assent to those contractual terms. Yeah, many of the same sort of thought processes apply. You want to make sure that you're getting acceptance for that.
And these would be in a terms of service or a
Sure.
service level agreement, like you agree to when you sign up for Google Apps, let's say.
Exactly. I mean, you'll see folks style it terms of use, terms of service. You know, those are common names for it.
Now, here's a question to kind of combine the two thoughts. Let's say you have a downloadable mobile social app where you've got intellectual property that's getting downloaded and installed, covered, which you're granting a license to.
Sure.
And then that access is then a service on the back end.
Sure.
Two agreements? License agreement and terms of service?
You know, from my perspective, it kind of depends on sort of what level of functionality is in that client software that you're downloading. If there is a lot of secret sauce in that, you know, maybe it's advisable to have two acceptance procedures. You know, one for the software itself. What I will often do, though, in most cases, I will have one agreement that will say, as part of that, you're accepting the license for the installable client software that resides on that mobile device, and you're also agreeing to these terms for the back-end service that provides the services behind it. So,
question there?
Along the same lines, if your software is using some open source code,
sure.
They have a different set of licensing. Is there likely to be any conflict between your agreement and open source agreement?
Really good question. I was actually, it's interesting you bring that up. I was teaching a class at Georgetown earlier this week just on that issue on open source software and the risks inherent in it. You know, suffice it to say, we could spend an entire sort of hour, 2 hours just on that topic. Open source software comes with its own set of terms, risks, and conditions. Many open source software licenses are very permissive, will allow you to incorporate them in a product that you're distributing down, as long as you flow through things like copyright notices and disclaimers down in your own license agreements. Some open source software, though, is somewhat viral in nature. If I use the term GPL, how many folks have heard of the GPL? Yeah. So
how many people haven't?
Yeah.
How many people don't know what the GNU public license is? Okay.
So suffice it to say that the GPL and what are known as the copyleft provisions, the sort of viral provisions of the GPL, can impose risk for folks that want to distribute their software in object code form only, and may impose, and depending on how you've architected your software, could impose the risk that you might need to distribute your software in source code form. That said, you know, these are sort of specific issues that come come up with open source software. Generally, if you are using open source software within your own code, sort of going back to some of the first things we talked about, you want to be aware of that. You want to make sure you're properly licensed to do so, and you want to make sure you're complying with those license terms if you're using it in your development. So,
question right here.
Yeah, I have, on this topic, open source, because I've always wondered about. There's a lot of open source licenses. You click through them. Has any of this ever gone to court? I mean, is this stuff real? I've never even heard of a single court case ever
sure.
involving anybody defending this. I mean, and who would sue you? And who
Yeah.
Does it actually exist?
It does exist. The risk is real. There are, the folks behind the GPL, the Free Software Foundation, are very active at sending letters, notices. They've entered settlement agreements with several companies. Probably the most prominent, at least from a couple of years ago, was Linksys, for instance. There are folks that do police this stuff. The question of who has standing to enforce it, it is the licensor of that code that has that standing. But yeah, I don't want to digress too much because this is a whole fascinating topic on the use of open source. Maybe,
but there is one angle here that's probably particularly important. There's one angle here that's probably particularly important, which is that this is about starting a company.
Yeah.
And we're trying to build a startup.
Yep.
At which point we need investors.
Yep.
Or we need to go through a due diligence. Or maybe we want to build something, we want to sell it to someone, and all of a sudden there's some GPL code in our proprietary software. What effect would that have on the potential sale of my hard work?
Yeah. Well, Guillermo, you teed it up.
You teed it up for both of us because I, as the M&A lawyer, I mean, I lead the team on an M&A transaction, but I have the tax lawyer specialist that comes in to talk about the tax structure of the deal. The employee benefits specialist, the labor and employment specialist, and then of course on virtually all my deals I turn to Sanjay for the intellectual property sections, and that's some of the stuff that gets very real when we're buying a company, and the seller puts into the data room, we have to look at their code and we have to look at their software. Sanjay's looking and asking questions. We have specific reps and warranties. Is there any open source software involved? Is there any GPL? So and we look at that and we have to determine then, did they comply with those agreements? Did they download the right disclaimers and notices into their own agreements? And if we find there's a problem, that becomes a huge, that could kill the deal, number one. If we're buying the IP, if that's the main thing we're buying and not the customer accounts or the business itself, it could cause a purchase price reduction. So I had a deal, for example, for a public company in the financial markets. I was buying a California company. We took $1 million off the table because they could not prove the chain of custody of their IP because they had some problems. And so we said, and then we, on top of lowering the price by $1 million, we took another $500,000, put it into a special escrow, and held that for 5 years to make sure that. So this guy lost 1.5 million, 1 million out the door, and 500,000 it was held in an escrow for 5 years, and that's still being held to this day. So it's a real problem. I mean, you have got to do this right.
So now we're a startup.
Yep.
We're starting to write code. We see a piece of software or maybe some graphics on a web page.
Sure.
Because attorneys are expensive.
Sure.
So what can a small startup do to avoid these problems?
Well, I think the answer on that is understand what you're downloading, understand what you're signing up for. Many open source licenses and many open source components out there are licensed under terms that are readily understandable, that are don't have some of these risks.
But if you don't understand, I'm old enough. Some people in here about my age. I mean, I'm old enough to remember a commercial when I was a kid. The guy in front of the gas station saying, about for Fram, filters, you can pay me now. and he holds it up, or he can pay me later because he points to a big transmission job. So, you know, you can come to someone like Sanjay and say, look, I'm not totally sure about what I'm downloading here and putting into my software, you know, and that's an hour or 2 hours of his time. That's a whole lot cheaper than when you build up to a $30 million a year company and you're selling to someone and then they lower the purchase price by $5 million, you know, then you're, yeah, so then you pay later. So it's a lot cheaper on the front end to get a little bit of advice and go to the right specialist to get that advice. You'll get it quickly and then move on and have peace of mind, as opposed to closing your eyes and thinking you've got it right and having it bite you in the rear end later.
One final thought, and when I advise people, we're using pieces of code, I always tell them, download the license agreement that goes with it, put it in a folder so that you can give it to your attorneys and show that clear documentation trail. And so that's what I mean about making your job easier. I mean, would you recommend that people keep a folder where everything is listed?
Yeah, police your developers. I think, you know, one of the challenges with a startup is that, you know, everybody's got a great idea. Everybody wants to get stuff done quickly. Everybody wants to find shortcuts to get there. Often, you know, what is open source code but a shortcut, right, at the end of the day? You know, folks will pull down open source code because it'll get them from point A to point B quicker. Know what's going in your product. Know what your developers are putting in your product. Keep track of that. Make your life easier. Who knows? Maybe you didn't dot every I and cross every T in your development process, and maybe it's something that you need to engineer around later. Much better to have records, as Guillermo said, so that you know what's in there, that you know what you need to engineer around. Because as Dean said, the last time you want to be doing this is when you have a financing transaction on the table, or when you have, or a sale of your company on the table. This is not the time where you want to come back and be reconstructing the architecture in your software and reconstructing how you got from point A to point B.
All right.
So.